everybody wants to get united. Like, what we gotta do is meet everybody on 149th Street at the bench.
Hey guys, welcome back to The Bench. Today we're going to be delving deep into the science behind how the letter B works. And through this video, we'll be checking out hand styles, throwaways, and pieces. That way you can use all this information no matter the form of graffiti you're doing. Keep in mind, we are keeping everything in a more neutral style. That way we can actually look at the fundamentals and how they function, and get a better understanding of this letter. That being said, all of the lessons in today's video can be applied to just about every letter. So without wasting any time, we're going to hop right into things with our very first letter B right up here. Now this first one is what's called a basic structure. It's the letter in its simplest form, in basic print font if you will. And we begin with a stem on the left hand side, and then a bowl on the top half, and then a bowl on the lower half. And the bowl connects back to the stem at the mean line right there. That's how you perform the letter, and if you do it that way, it'll always be correct. Now when you do those bowls, you'll also simultaneously make your closed counter. Now by making those bowls, we'll also simultaneously create a closed counter. And that's what these are as well. And really the bowl and the closed counter is what gives the B a lot of its visual aesthetic. So you'll notice if we were to go ahead and connect the bowl higher on the stem, we end up diminishing how much negative space we have on the top, but we increase the amount of negative space we have on the bottom, which adds weight to the bottom and can make the B look a little bit more stable. On the other hand, if we were to go ahead and connect the bowl lower on the stem, we increase the negative space at the top of the B, increasing the weight up there as well, and we decrease the negative space on the bottom of the B, making the B look a little bit more unbalanced, but a little bit more dynamic as well. And there's a lot we can do with this letter, right? That's just a simple example, and you can exaggerate that how you see fit. You can even exaggerate it more if you'd like, or less. And that's all just the basic structure B. But on top of that, we have variant structure Bs, like these two right here. So there's plenty of variant structure Bs, and if you're wondering to yourself, where can I find a full list of this? Check out the link in the description down below. We wrote up a whole blog about it, and we show you every single variant structure. It's completely free, and once again, there's a link in the description to that. A lot of you guys tell me, John, I feel like I need a mentor, I want a mentor, I don't know where to find a mentor. This book is essentially a graffiti mentor, just in a book. It'll teach you everything you need to know about graffiti. You want to learn the fundamentals? This book has it. You want to learn all about variant structure? This book has it. You want to learn all about style and how to flow? This book has it. It's great for new graffiti artists just getting into things, as well as intermediate and expert graffiti artists who want to really get a much deeper understanding for the fundamentals. We have digital copies on our online store, theartistblock.inc, with physical copies over on Amazon. I got a link to all that in the description down below for you guys. Check it out. So you'll see with these Bs, they adopt a different shape, right? This one is much more triangular, as to where this one is a lot more square on the top. And as a result of this, we have different kinds of negative space associated with the letter, not only internally, but also externally. So this more triangular letter B has less negative space than our basic structure B on the inside closed counter, while adding a little bit more negative space on the outer edges of the letter B. It also gains a little bit more of an unbalanced look because the one contact point the letter has with the baseline is pretty much right there. So as a result of that, this B also tends to look very dynamic and is great for adding style. Granted, all of them are great for adding style depending on how you use it, but you get the point. So this other B over here has a lot more natural weight at the top of its structure, and depending on how you utilize the bottom, you can make the letter as a whole look a lot more sturdy than just your average B would. Or you can make it look a lot more dynamic if you were to say go with a more angled bottom as well as the square top. Now for our lowercase b's, things change in a strange way when it comes to how our lines interact with one another. So here we have three different b's, and you'll notice this circle right here is actually kind of disconnected from the stem. It doesn't connect directly to a vertex like we've been seeing previously. It kind of connects right over here during an overlap, and this allows your circle piece to be a lot more flexible with its positioning and how you utilize it. This is something that you'll really begin to see during your pieces, as pieces put a heavy emphasis on connecting back at your vertices. Now this second B here also has the stem, as they all do, but this time, similar to our first one up here, the bowl begins at the mean line and then comes back down to the bottom of the stem. This gives us a much different closed counter where the complete left side of the closed counter is straight, as that's made by the stem itself. Now we have probably the most common B you'll see in graffiti, and that's the one where you come straight down for the stem and you go directly into the bowl itself. In this process, this line right here does connect back down to the bottom of the stem. But this portion of the line, when it ends over here, it really has the kind of freedom to shoot over a little bit or shoot out a little bit, which you actually might see some people do in their tags, and especially in their pieces. Something you will notice amongst these three different lowercase b's is that their total space is a lot more narrow than our capital B's. And this is typical to see. Now, obviously, you can change that based on how wide you make the bowl, right? If I were to do a bowl that's far reaching, well, suddenly that's gonna have a lot more total space. But normally speaking, they're gonna have a slighter total space than their capital counterparts. Now, the interesting thing with these letters is the second you lean them over to the right, they begin to look as if they're tipping over very quickly. Now, this is partially because of their rounded bottom nature, where rounded bottoms tend to be very unstable and they are easily tipped off balance. But if we tip these letters on over to their left-hand side, they maintain some of that balance. And this is because they have not only the stem still supporting, but most of their weight is located in the bowl on the opposite side, which acts kind of like an anchor and holds the letter down just a little bit. By leaning these letters, we can give ourselves a little bit more total space to work with, because as you'll see, suddenly now we have a bit more negative space on the bottom left portion of the letter and a bit more negative space in the right-hand portion I'm filling in currently, which that can be used as a great way to overlap letters and have other letters fill in these empty areas. Now for our Throwie B, you'll see that nothing in the base structure Throwie really changes. Yeah, sure, the letter doesn't really look all that flashy. So we come back up for our stem just as we did up here, and then really we're just doing a general rounded shape for the bowl, another general rounded shape for the bowl once again, and once again we're meeting at the mean line, just as we did up here. Our close counters this time are suggested because Throwies tend to lack a lot of negative space, and suggesting our close counters in this way helps us to speed things along and once again keep a more generalized shape for our letters. But there's a lot we can do with a Throwie letter B. This is, once again, these are, this is just the basic structure. There's nothing fancy going on there. That's to give you an idea of how the letter might look, how it functions. But we can easily go ahead and extrude the back portion of this B by continuing this line past the stem. And by doing that, you'll notice now we have this little piece out here, and that adds just a little bit of flair, a little bit of pop to the letter itself. And if you wanted, you can do something very easily like that, which looks a lot better. Or, staying with the same basic structure B, we can choose to round this top portion and go directly into the bowl, and a simple change like that will give us a much different looking letter structure. Now keep in mind, even with the Throwie, we still have a lot of freedom and we could do a lot of the same changes that we experience in the hand style. And this is why it's important to practice your tags as well, because learning what a letter can do in your tag oftentimes teaches you what you can do with your Throwies and pieces as well. So in other words, we can do to our Throwie the same exact things that we've done to our hand styles. We could lean our Throwie, just like we did with the lowercase b's, not to mention the fact that all of the variant structures can also be turned into Throwies as well. And we can also connect our bowl higher or lower up the stem, just as we did previously as well. And then of course we could do any combination of all of those different things to arrive at pretty much an infinite amount of possibilities as to adding style to our letter B. And as if that wasn't enough, we can also go ahead and start messing with lines and how we go ahead and draw those lines. Instead of being a straight stem like that, we can have something a little bit more curved. And because we're tilting the B, now suddenly our bowl connects at the mean line, sure, but now it comes in at the mean line at an angle. And it exits at an angle as well, which gives us a much more dynamic looking letter B. So when it comes to our lowercase b, we're going to take the lessons we took from the hand style, and now we're going to apply it to the actual Throwie. And all that means really is that once again, our stem is going from the base line to the cap line, and then we have the rest of the stem drawn right there. From here, the bowl takes over and it connects back down to the bottom of the stem. Now this is a pretty versatile letter, so we have a lot of freedom with how we go ahead and draw that. You can go ahead and draw the stem a little bit more straight like this one did, and then kind of come out the same way this lowercase did and back into the baseline. Or you can kind of separate the stem from the bowl just a little bit while still having them connected, and you'll see that here where it's disconnected right in this general area, and then we go up for the stem and then continue for the bowl. And the bowl is segmented away from the stem, as this bowl is its own complete shape that doesn't necessarily connect back to this point on the stem. More like what you would see over here, as this little notch here would be that little piece right there. Of course, lowercase, just like the uppercase, you can do any of the variant structures in Throwy form and it'll still work. Moving on to pieces. This is a fun letter to rock with pieces because there is a plethora of things you could do and a lot of style that we could pack into this letter. First, let's break down how the actual letter comes together as far as its anatomy is concerned. Let's take the fill-in out and let's focus on just the actual sketching process for this initially. So once again, you begin with the stem from the cap line to the base line. That's usually how you're going to want to treat just about every letter in the alphabet. And there's the stem right there. Now, if you understand your basic piecing anatomy and how your basic boxes function, then you understand that our bowl has to connect on a vertex on either this part of the stem or this part of the stem. But because the trajectory of the bowl right here is the same angle as the top of our stem, we're not visually going to be able to see where the bowl actually connects anywhere on this line. And believe it or not, that gives us a lot of freedom, especially when adding style. So just to keep things simple, we are going to say we're connecting right back here and our bowl continues from that point. Now this line is going to connect just below the mean line. And the reason for that is because we not only need to make enough room for the rest of the bowl, but we also need to make enough room for the closed counter here. And if we went ahead and connected our bowl really high while keeping the bowl the same size, then suddenly we're not going to have pretty much any room for our closed counter, as you'll see right there. So once again, we'll connect right back here just under the mean line, and then we'll go ahead and we'll continue the rest of it. Now, to determine the width of this bowl here, this basic box if you will, we're going to want to make it comparable to our stem. You'll notice that the beginning of our bowl is very comparable in its width to our stem. And then as we reach the apex of the bowl, just in this area here, it tends to get a lot wider. This is something you'll see in just about any rounded letter, whether it's O, C, G, B, R, S, you know, anything like that, you're gonna see that widening effect a lot of times. So we maintain that width and you'll notice what happens. We have just enough room for a closed counter right there. Now it's at this point we have our two new vertices for our next bowl. We have this one right here and then that one right there, created by our first bowl. So in order to begin our next bowl, all we have to do is use those two dots to then create our next bowl. And this line we're drawing now is going to connect right to the bottom of the stem, and same exact effect up here where we can connect anywhere along this line and it will work. Now obviously as you add style, that's gonna change. If we come in with a more triangular bowl, well then suddenly, because of the trajectory that we're working in, this line is not gonna be following this same trajectory. So we will have to connect right back here. And this line will have to connect over here. And that's something we demonstrate with our next B, the variant structure B as well, where once again we have the stem just as we just showed you, and you'll notice this time because the trajectory is different, we can't connect the first bowl anywhere along this line here. We have to actually connect this basic box right there to this vertex as well as that vertex. And by doing that, we can make our bowl. So that's the first part of the triangular bowl. So to finish off the bowl, all we have to do is find this vertex and that vertex and then draw our next basic box right to the stem. And just like we saw on the basic structure, we're going to have this line, or in this case, this lower line, connect just beneath the mean line right there, and this line connect just above the mean line. And that gives us enough room for our closed counter. And also gives us a nice trajectory for the very top of our next line for the bowl. That, of course, is going to connect right back to that vertex right there. And then we finish it off with this part of the bowl, which you'll notice does not have to connect back to any vertex because this one's already taken care of it. And you can't see where this would connect as there is no vertex. For the lowercase b, we actually get a really good look at what's really happening with this structure here. Now this one over here is really nothing special, right? We kind of already have seen it when we made our first letter B and we made the lower portion of it. That's really all this lowercase b is. It's just the uppercase b missing the top half. That being said, this lowercase b is a very stable letter in its piecing form and might be worth your time if you got a B in your name. Now I personally prefer this one right here, the one that kind of flows from the stem directly into the bowl. And once again, we get a really good look at what's anatomically happening here, where we have our stem as per usual, but this time the bowl connects here and there. Now the line that connects to this vertex here is going to kind of creep along the stem's edge and then become a much more rounded line before getting lost in the structure, as to where this part of the bowl is going to have a trajectory that leads us directly to this vertex. So you would just follow that right through the bowl and connect right back to that same vertex. Now there's a lot of stylistic things we can do with the lowercase letter b right in this area here. Perhaps maybe you establish this portion and then you decide decide to go ahead and cut the letter B off there, segmenting the actual stem in this area from the rest of the B here. You could also just have the letter B kind of travel through, and that just kind of paints a picture, gives you an example of how that works. Because the structure is already complete by the time you come around this bend and reach the stem, you can keep pushing the bowl past the stem if you'd like. Now, this letter B tends to be less stable than this one, in piecing form especially, and all of that has to do with the fact that it's got that rounded bottom, which you'll see is actually what lands on the baseline. The stem doesn't really land on the baseline because you have to account for the more rounded base of the actual structure itself that's going to reach a little bit lower. So in its most basic form, this B has a slightly shorter stem, and this one has a slightly longer stem, but this one might look a little bit more dynamic because of the imbalance that it has innately within its structure. Now, understand, there is a lot of different letter Bs out there. Be sure to check the blog that we wrote up that shows and demonstrates all variant structures. That way you can kind of familiarize yourself with a lot of these different kinds of Bs out there. Enough of that. I want to get to the speed painting. I want to see what some of these letters can do and experiment and play around with them a little bit. And as we move on to the speed painting, I want to just go ahead and throw it out there. I'm sorry this, video came out so long after the first one in the series. I wasn't able to record my screen for the longest time due to some technical things that weren't really coexisting well, and I struggled to get them to work together, but we finally got it. So I hopefully will be coming out with the series a lot more frequently, and I can get to your favorite letters sooner as a result of that. But that all depends on if you guys are feeling this series. If you guys are feeling it, let me know with the like button. That's how I know, that's how I gauge what videos to come out with and how often to come out with them. Now keep in mind with the series, this series is not meant to lock you into one way of doing letters. It's to show you the basic fundamentals and the anatomy of the letters. That way you have more freedom to add your style to that. And a lot of these lessons are applicable to all letters. So if I haven't gotten to your letter just yet, then try to apply these lessons to the letters in your name and see if it works out. Now, whenever you have a letter that has purely a rounded bottom, like this does right here, and like these throwy Bs do, you're going to be balancing the letter based on its center of gravity or based on the neighboring letters. If your letter is off balanced because of the rounded bottoms, it's possible that if you have a letter that's leaning and is a little bit imbalanced, other letters beside it can help hold it up. But if we want to balance the center of gravity, then you're going to want to make sure you have comparable amounts of weight on both sides of the letter. Or if you're looking for a more dynamic letter, then don't have comparable weights on both sides. Kind of like you'll notice right here. Sometimes you might want something to look a little bit unbalanced, and that's perfectly fine. Alright, now for the fun part, where we dive into the sketch and we begin working with the letter B. So a few things to keep in mind about this letter. Going over the fundamentals of like the actual base structure itself and how that functions. The capital letter B is great. It's phenomenal, not only for adding weight to a name, as it, as you might imagine, it's a pretty weighty letter, but it's got a great amount of negative space as well that you can really utilize, and it's very dynamic. You can make the negative space really enlarged to increase in negative space, or you can kind of choke the negative space out and limit how much of it you see. All of this not really affecting the letter structure all too much in a negative way. As for some other letters, if you want to get rid of a lot of negative space, it can hamper the letter structure a little bit. That doesn't so much happen with the letter B. Not to mention the fact that you have a wide range of variant structures at your disposal in order to change the actual shape of the letter itself, which allows you to flow a little bit easier with other letters of your name, depending on, well, the other letters of your name. So it's a very versatile letter. Also, the letter B is made out of a lot of basic boxes, so there's a lot of letter structure there, and with that, that means that we have a lot more opportunities to flow with line uniformity and similarity. We have more interesting ways we can overlap, and we have a little bit more things we could do with letter distortions as we become a little bit more advanced. The lowercase letter B, as far as its fundamentals are concerned, depending on the kind of lowercase you're using, it can have a decent amount of balance, but typically it's not going to be anywhere near as balanced as the capital version. That being said though, if you're not really familiar with your fundamentals, if you're a little uneasy about letter name positioning, negative space management, and letter name weight, or if your letter structures are just a little bit more sloppy, then you can very easily run into issues with the balance of this letter. But normally that's going to be a result of, not keeping it simple and adding just a little bit too much style for your current level, and that's normally what will cause problems there. Now, one thing that's great about letters like B that have a massive stem on the left-hand side is they become very easy to flow with neighboring letters, as the stem usually gives you a decent amount of line uniformity and similarity with the previous letter. Now, if the letter B is at the beginning of your name, well, then there isn't much of a previous letter in that instance, but because of the B's rounded nature on the right-hand side, those rounded edges really let you kind of get back to that flow. Now, if you're using more like a square top or a square bottom B or a more triangular structure for the bowls, then you're going to have a little bit more specific angles that you're going to need to hit for line uniformity and similarity with neighboring letters on the right-hand side of the B. But keep in mind, these aren't really problematic, right? Always remember remember, if there's one thing about flow that you should always keep at the forefront of your mind, is that flow happens automatically with all base structures. So you can have a more triangular lowercase b and it'll naturally flow with any other base structure without you having to do anything, assuming all your fundamentals are right. So do always keep that in mind. Where we begin to see a lot of common problems with the capital letter structure is more so the fact of how heavy it is and how it can outweigh other letters in some people's work. It's really easy for the letter name weight to kind of get out of hand in some people's hand styles, in their throwies, especially in their pieces, especially in their wild styles. Now this is typically a problem for anybody who's intermediate or a bit newer. That's not really something you're going to see a professional level graffiti artist run into issues with. They're usually very accustomed to it by that point. A different issue we'll oftentimes see is because the B has such a proclivity for style, because it's so easy to stylize, it oftentimes becomes more stylized than other letters in the name, and as a result it ends up losing flow as a result of that, because it begins to contrast the amount of detail the other letters have. The B having a lot of detail, a lot of style, and the other letters lacking that same emphasis. But what we find to be the case is that a lot of people end up having to hold their letter B back stylistically, that way it doesn't outrun and outpace the other letters in their name that they may not be as comfortable with. Maybe let's just say, for example, the numbers are arbitrary only to, kind of paint a picture here, but let's say, for example, somebody has a skill level of 10 with the letter B, but their other letters are more at a skill level of like 5, 6. Well, then your letter B is going to begin to outpace those other letters. So you kind of have to then put your letter B at a 5 or a 6 aesthetically, just so like that it flows and matches the other letters in the name. If you find yourself doing this, then this right here is a clear indication that you're really going to want to hunker down and study the fundamentals of those other letters. Maybe do a little bit of a focused study for those letters specifically to kind of build them up in level. That way they catch up to the letter B as well. Oh, I almost forgot to mention this. A really great tip with the letter B, and just really any letter structure that has a lot of basic boxes, is that you can oftentimes use the letter itself to build other letters out of. And that's a great way to make some letters look really unique. Let's say you have the letter O, for example, and there's always a certain way you do the letter O, but you use a letter B to build the O now instead? Well, now your letter O might look much different than what you've previously done in the past. Now keep in mind, when you're doing this, you still want to keep the actual anatomy of the letter in mind. You don't want to just suddenly be like, oh, now because I'm using the letter B and, to make the O, I don't have to pay attention to how the letter O functions. You still very much have to pay mind to that. But you can use pieces of your letter B in this instance to build other letters. Maybe you use the bowl as a portion of the letter O. And keep in mind, we're just using the letter O as, an example here. It can be any letter of the alphabet, but maybe use a portion of the letter B for it. And then maybe you make up the rest. That right there is like a cheat code to letter uniformity and similarity. Now granted, I don't recommend necessarily doing that with other people's work because, we've talked about how to learn and how to find inspiration here on this channel and how to do that in a productive way. But doing that with your own work is certainly a great idea. Now personally, when it comes to letter B, I tend to favor the capital letter B, which is weird because in all honesty, the lowercase structures are really dynamic. They're very, very dope. And there's a lot you can do with that just with the dynamism of the letter innately, right? Since it has all that weight on the bottom, you can play around a lot with that. But the capital B's are really good at filling in negative space, and there's a lot you can do with that as well with just their letter structure. There's a lot of style you can imbue into those bowls especially, and the stem as well. Now the reason I went with a square bottom was because I knew that I wanted to pair this with a landscape, so I kind of had this B in mind initially, but that isn't going to stop me from playing around with other letters, right? You should always explore different ideas, and in previous tutorials and previous videos we talk a lot about exploring styles, exploring your own style, finding a new style, and how to go about doing that properly. So that's kind of what we're actually putting into practice right here, where alright, we see this letter B, we see what we did to it, but now we're going to try a different letter B, where we're not going to do any of those same things. So instead of leaning the letter really hard to the left and going for a square bottom, we're going to keep that triangular bowl, we're going to keep one feature, but we're going to go for a straight stem and a bowl with a little bit more roundness on the bottom, and we're going to see how that works. But one thing I really want to point out with these letter B's is how different they look and how different they react to the fundamentals as we make these small changes. As you'll see, despite the fact that we have a lot of triangular bowls here, the letter B's in those areas have a decent variety to them. One letter B has a lot of weight at the top, as for some of the others have little to no weight at the top, and they have different weight distributions with different negative spaces. Now this is just the letter B here, we're not doing a full-blown piece, so that negative space isn't really going to come as a factor as far as other letters are concerned because there aren't any other letters. But if you were doing a full name, then yeah, you'd have to worry about how some of this negative space will affect the neighboring letters. fundamentals. So do keep that in mind. One thing I see a lot when people ask me for a critique is they kind of stylistically hop quite a bit, and they don't really have refined fundamentals to have the ability to stylistically hop, which is a bit of a red flag, as it indicates that you're doing a lot of referencing. You're looking at your inspirations, you're looking at people that you enjoy quite a bit, and you're trying to pull lessons from them, but that's resulting in you more so copying and stripping the visual aesthetics that they have and slapping them onto your own thing without really understanding the underlying anatomy of what it is they're doing, or not understanding the anatomy of the letter and graffiti itself. So next time you kind of feel that urge pulling to you, take a second look, take a second to pause and look at your inspirations and ask yourself, how does the letter work? Take it one fundamental at a time. Look at letter structure. How are they building the letter? What is the different anatomical pieces of this letter? Let me find the stem, let me find the bowl, let me find X, Y, and Z. Now, if you can manage to understand how the letter is being built and how they're using that letter in conjunction with the neighboring letters, then you'll find yourself in a really great spot to begin breaking down their style. Perhaps you see the very first B that I drew with a really deep left lean, and then you see that maybe my next letter fills in a lot of the negative space on the right hand side of our B. Well, now you kind of get a better idea, a better gist of how we're combining those two letters and their fundamentals together. Our B makes negative space with its lean, the next letter fills negative space with maybe its lean or its letter structure. And then you can take those qualities and apply that to your piece as opposed to taking a letter itself. And what you'll find is the more and more you do this, the more and more lessons you understand, and the deeper you'll understand the fundamentals as well. And that'll allow you to pull in more and more lessons into your own work in more interesting ways as well. You see, that's really the awesome thing about style, is the style, yes, it's the exaggeration of the fundamentals. You hear me say it here on the channel quite a bit, but it's also how you understand those very factual fundamentals. The fundamentals are concrete. The fundamentals don't change. We have a lot of say, a lot of freedom, a lot of leeway with how we go ahead and use our letter structure, negative space management, letter name weight, letter name positioning, and flow. You can see that right here in just these B's. But say, for example, you got a friend who also does graffiti and they understand letter structure pretty decently. They can only exaggerate letter structure so much based on how they understand letter structure and how much they understand it. But you understand letter structure a lot more. Well, you can exaggerate letter structure to a greater degree. And that can be applied to negative space management, letter name weight, letter name positioning, flow, line, shape, form, value, space, color, texture, and any combination of all of those things. And that's precisely what we're doing here. We're keeping the letter structure very simple because I want this to be kind of a cozy looking image. I don't want to busy it up too much. I want to keep things very loose. So our letter structure is going to be pretty simplistic. Another reason it's also going to be simplistic is because I want a greater amount of detail in the general area of the letter structure as well. So if the letter has a lot of detail and the general area has a lot of detail, well then suddenly things become a little bit too busy. Now this has been really weird for me artistically because, alright, for those of you guys who don't know, I came from a hyper-realistic background, and there's a few different philosophies, disciplines if you will, of hyper-realism. Some people have the philosophy of you can suggest detail while keeping things very loose and achieve hyper-realism that way, and that works. That 1000% works. And then there's another philosophy where, well, in real life, everything exists in ridiculous detail, therefore you can paint ridiculous detail and the human brain will automatically eliminate a lot of that detail, a lot of that white noise, if your focal point is clear. Now that's the kind of discipline I went down. That's the path of hyperrealism that I followed. So once I began studying concept art and comic books and digging my hand into those industries and how they work, it was the polar opposite. It was less is more. You don't need detail everywhere. You only need it where your focal point is. And that took some getting used to for me, right? So that's still something I'm very much working on, and this painting is definitely helping with that. So this letter B, the way I want it to exist is I want the letter to be a little bit more dynamic, and for that reason we're actually going to be doing a 2-point perspective letter B, and this isn't nearly as hard as what it sounds. If you could draw a cube in 2-point perspective, you can do graffiti in 2-point perspective. It's that simple. But one of the reasons I wanted it to go ahead and do this in 2-point perspective is because the letter structure would be on the left hand side of our cube. Interestingly enough, our 3D would be on the right hand side of that cube, filling in a lot of that negative space that this letter B had as a result of its left lean. This gives us a phenomenal opportunity to add a building to the letter itself. That way the building can also help fill in a lot of that negative space. So the objective here is to use the building as a means to tether the graffiti into the environment a little bit more, helping the letter B to kind of coexist in this world and help it look a little less alien. Obviously it's a letter B, so it's going to look alien pretty much regardless, as buildings aren't usually necessarily made in the shape of letters, but that's where the fun comes in. That's where our artistic interpretation and our own style can kind of bleed into this, and we get to have a little bit of fun of how we blend those two things together. All the while, we are following perspective, we are still keeping scale in mind and things of that nature, and we're keeping the letter structure in mind. Nothing that the building is doing is really going to hurt our letter. And because the letter is far away from the viewer, we're not necessarily close to the letter B, we're not going to be able to see nitty-gritty details as well, and as a result of that, we want to keep the letter nice and clean as to not muddy up its structure. If the letter B was closer, if this was composed a little bit differently, then yeah, sure, we can cram in a bunch of detail, as I've done in previous pieces in the past. But this is something you can actually check in real life. The further away from something that we are, the less details we're going to see. And we're going to kind of reflect that here in this image. You'll see that this is something that Mad C actually does in many of her murals, where she features multiple pieces. The pieces that aren't the focal point, the pieces that are further in the background, well, they get less detail. And we're doing the same exact thing here. I encourage you guys, if you guys are putting backgrounds with your graffiti, try to integrate the two in an interesting way. See how you can kind of bleed them together and make the graffiti feel like it's a part of that environment, rather than just kind of plopping your graffiti directly on top of a static background. So now that we're rocking the graffiti in this painting here, we have to kind of keep something in mind, right? Because I'm kind of integrating this letter into the actual environment itself, the letter becomes more than just a letter, and we need to incorporate some elements of whatever we're connecting it into. In this case, while we're still trying to keep things very simplistic, we're gonna go ahead and connect the house to this. So I'm gonna want my letter B to have a roof, I'm gonna throw a chimney on there, we're gonna put some wood borders because this is like more like an old country-ish style house. We want some grit and some texture in there, so I want to show some bricks and some stone. And because we want this to be the focal point, this will be the only area we see certain colors. This will also be the only area where we begin to pack in more details. You'll notice that most of the grass here, almost all of it, has pretty much no detail at all. It's got like 1 or 2 values, maybe 3 if it's lucky, and everything remains very much suggested. And the reason we're focusing the colors here is that way the actual piece and the graffiti stays as the focal point. That's where your eyes want to stay. Everything else is just a backdrop to our graffiti. Now, how does this relate to when you're working in your books? Well, if you're adding a background to your stuff like your exterior details, your key lines, which are also often called force fields, or maybe you're doing some characters, remember, they are there to aid and augment your graffiti. If you're doing designs and you're organizing your characters in such a way where maybe you don't feel like they really help your graffiti, then try to rework it. Try to see if you can find a different way to illustrate that thing, whether it's your key line, whether it's your characters, or whether it's the background, so that it actually plays a role in helping your graffiti. And there's an infinite amount of ways you could do that. Really, creativity is the limit on that. Alright dudes, that just about wraps up today's video. Let me know what you guys thought about it in the comments down below. If you have any questions, also feel free to ask. I'll be more than happy to help any of you guys out in the comments, and I'll try to get back to as many of you guys as possible. If you want a lot more information about graffiti, I'm talking a ridiculous amount, like it's essentially a graffiti mentor in a book, then check out our book in the description down below. We have digital ebooks on our online store, theartistblock.inc, with physical copies over on Amazon. Once again, I got a link to it in the description down below. You won't regret it.